Hello folks, welcome to Chapter 13, Saving, Investment, and the Financial System.
Financial system is the group of institutions in the economy, and that system will help match the saving of one person with the investment of another. More savings means more investment, but savings from the individual consumers and the investment for the companies and how to match them together, that's the financial system. For financial institutions, it includes financial markets and the financial intermediaries. Again, it should be the directly. For financial institutions through which the savers can directly provide funds to borrowers, directly here. So for financial institutions, it includes financial markets and the financial intermediaries. Financial markets, again, it should be directly, right? The financial markets includes two markets. The first is the bond market. A bond is a certificate of indebtedness. The second one is the stock market. A stock is a claim to partial ownership in a firm. You should remember that these two markets are financial markets. What bond market means? The bond is an IOU that specifies principles, which means the amount borrowed. Like what companies or countries, who can issue bonds? The really huge companies can issue it, or local state government or federal government. These four parts could issue bonds. So how much money they need, that's the amount of money they want to borrow. And that amount is the principles, the amount borrowed. The bond also includes the date of maturity, the time at which the loan will be repaid. Rate of interest that the borrower will pay periodically until the loan matures. The bond bearers is the lenders, can hold the bond until the maturity, or he or she can sell the bond at an earlier date to someone else. But at that date, the rate of interest is different from the rate of interest on that bond. So the interest will be different if the buyers or lenders want to sell it earlier than that mature date. And again, the borrowers for the bond market, they are large corporations, the federal government, or state and the local government. Only 4 entities could issue a bond. So this slide is the US Treasury bond. You can see there are different maturities. With different maturities, you have different yield rates, right? When the maturity gets longer, from 1 month to 30 years, you can see the yield rate or the interest rate gets bigger. The US 10 years Treasury bond rate, 1.3%. This is really important. Usually, we call this rate, 10 years bond rate, as the risk-free rate. And this is not only important in the United States, but also important in other countries, because it's used in valuation models to calculate the value of assets, including shares, property, infrastructure, and the fixed interest investment. So this interest rate is very important. Usually we call it as the risk-free rate, and for other assets, we are going to use this rate to calculate the other assets, the returns or interest rate. part that's important, and you need to remember there are 4 characteristics of bonds for bonds market. The first characteristic is the term, the length of time until the bond matures. So it should be divided into short terms and long terms. Usually for short terms, it's less than 3 years. And for the long terms, the maturity period is between 10 years and 30 years. Less than 3 years, short terms. Longer than 10 years, longer terms. So that's short term and that's longer term. I don't know what this two means or should be called. But that doesn't matter. What you need to remember is this one I marked. The long-term bonds is riskier than higher interest. It's riskier, and which also means the higher interest. For the government bond, that's the same, right? The longer, the higher interest rate, because that's higher risk. And that's also true for the huge corporations bond. And that's usually for the huge corporations. Because for the government, no matter for the local, the state, or the federal level, usually there is no risk. But for the large corporations, they issue bond if the maturity period is longer, which means there should be a higher risk for that large corporation to repay you. So usually, the longer the riskier, and should be have a higher interest rate. Never matures is called perpetuity. The perpetuity pays interest forever, but the principal is never repaid. That's the definition for perpetuity. The next one is the credit risk. It's the probability of borrower's default. The definition of default on bond is the borrower fails to pay some of the interest or the principals. Here is all, no matter which one is the fail to repay, and that's the default. Some companies or corporations, and again, this usually happened to the corporations, not to the government level. But for some countries, it happens. But for the United States, usually, this credit risk is almost zero. For some big corporations, they usually have some financial difficulties, and in that case, for them, they cannot repay their principals or interest at the end of that maturity period. So that's called the default on a bond. And usually, high probability of default means a higher interest rate. The definition for junk bonds, which usually issued by financial shaky corporations, usually by corporations, right? Because for most government, the risk or credit risk is almost zero. But for corporations, we don't know, although they are huge companies. Because of some cases like pandemic recently, it will influence the corporations a lot, influence their operations and influence their returns. And for the junk bonds, the pay should be very high for interest rate. So for this slide, what you need to remember is the longer term and the higher interest rate, or high probability of default. Default means fail to repay either interest rate or principals, which should pay a higher interest rate. The next two characteristics of bonds are tax treatment and inflation protection. For tax treatment, the way the tax laws treat the interest earned on the bond. So interest on most bond is taxable income, but except this one, the municipal bonds. It's issued by the state and the local government. It's state and local, alright? It's not federal. Federal government is not here. Just by the state and the local government, usually you do not need to pay the tax for your profit. But just because of there is no tax, the return or the yield rate or the interest rate for the municipal bonds should have lower interest rates. Just because there is no tax for the state or local government's bonds. Does it offer inflation protection? Normally, for most bonds, there is the interest rate or the principles is just the nominal term. It's just a specific number of dollars. You are going to give it to them. You need to borrow that amount of money to them, and that's still the amount of money, the nominal term they need to repay to you. But there are some other type of bonds, like indexed to measure the inflation. Remember the definition we learned in chapter 11. The indexation, a dollar amount is indexed for inflation if it's automatically corrected for inflation by law or contract. For this this type of bonds, the payment will rise if there is an inflation, the price rise, CPI goes up, and then the payment will rise proportionally. If this happens, and then the interest rate for this type of bond should be lower. And the same logic for this two, right? For the tax, if there is no tax, that's the benefit or that's the advantage for this type of bonds, and which means the interest rate should be lower because that bond is more attractive. And the same for this one. If the interest rates are corrected after the inflation, which also have an advantage for this type of bond. So this type of bond should also have a lower interest rate or yield rate. The Treasury Inflation Protected Security, TIPS, is one type of this bond. Again, what you need to remember in this slide is some advantage. The interest rate should be lower. For the first two characteristics, if there is some disadvantage here, more risk, or if it's riskier, then the interest rate should be higher. That's four characteristics of bonds. The next part is the stock market. Stock market, a share of stock ownership in your firm, therefore is a claim to some of the profits that the firm makes, carry greater risk but offer potentially higher returns. The stock market is the equity finance. It's a sales of stock to raise money. For the bond market, it's the debt finance. Sell bond to raise money. What's different between the debt finance and equity finance? Well, for example, if a business is very profitable, and then the stockholders, which the people who buy stock of that company, is going to enjoy the benefit of this profit, which means the more revenues that company is going to earn, the more benefit the stockholders are going to require or going to obtain. But for the bondholders, they are only going to get the interest rate which arises on that bond. No matter how much revenue, how higher the revenue, the profit that company gets, the bondholders will always get a fixed amount of interest rate. So that's the difference between the equity finance and the debt finance. And that's also the difference between the stock and the bonds. Last part or last case, I just introduced the benefit for the stock holders. But there is also the benefit for the bondholders. Like if there is the huge revenue for the companies, the stockholders could get more revenues compared with the bondholders. But what if the companies doesn't have a huge revenue or face financial critical difficulties, didn't perform well? What will happen in that case? Well, then the bondholders will get the benefit anyway, because that rights on the bond, right? The company should repay the bondholders the interest rate, whatever rights on that bond. But for the stockholders, how much interest rate or how much revenues they are going to earn it depends. If the firms didn't earn the benefit, then maybe the stockholders will face some lose. No benefit, but lose. So that's the difference between the stock and the bond, the benefit and the disadvantage. If the company face a huge revenue, which means the stockholders is better than the bondholders. But if the company doesn't perform well, then the bondholders is better than the stockholders. Stock exchange, trading stock shares among stockholders, and the business receive no money when the stockholders trade their own stocks. The business will only receive money when they sell their own stocks or they sell their own shares. In that case, the business will receive some money. Price of shares on stock exchange determined by the supply and demand for the stock in these companies. And again, the same as chapter 4, when we talk about the price, the quantity usually is decided by the demand and the supply curve. And here, for the price of stock, it's the same. If there is more demand for that stock, which means the price will go up, right? If nobody wants that company's stock, the company's share, then the price for that company's stock will decrease. The demand of a stock reflects the people's perception of the corporation's future profitability. Here, it should be the future. If the price of that corporation's stock will increase or decrease at this moment, it depends on the people at this moment, the expectation. Such as, for example, for me, if I expect that the price of stock for Tesla will increase in the future, which means the Tesla will receive more revenues in the future. In that case, I'm going to buy some amount of Tesla stock. And if more people have the same expectations as me, which means the demand for Tesla's stock will increase. And then the price for Tesla's stock will increase. But just at this moment, right? At this moment, the price for Tesla stock will increase. And what caused that? Just because all buyers like me, we expect that the revenue of Tesla's company will increase in the future. So that's the future probability of revenue, the future profitability. Stock index is an average of a group of stock prices. So 2 examples, the Dow Jones Industrial Average. For Dow Jones, it's based on the prices of the stocks of 30 major US companies. And for the Standard & Poor's 500 index, that's the price of the stock of 500 major companies. So Dow Jones 50 and the Standard & Poor's 500 is 500 major companies average price. So for stock and bond, that's the financial market, which the company or government can borrow money directly from borrowers. And the next part is the financial intermediaries. For financial intermediaries, the institutions through which savers can indirectly provide funds to borrowers. Financial system, the borrowers can borrow directly. For financial intermediaries, the borrowers only could borrow money indirectly. Two examples, banks and the mutual funds. For banks, it's easier, right? Because we contact or we know banks. I think we are familiar with banks. The primary role of for banks, they take in deposits from savers, some small, and give the savers some small amount of interest rate. They collect the deposit and use that amount of deposit to loan to the borrowers, and they charge the borrowers a higher interest rate. So the difference will be the benefit for the banks. That's the first role for banks. And the second role is the facilitate purchases of goods and services. Usually the bank could provide the checks and the debit cards to access the deposit. That's convenient for savers. For savers, they can write check. For others, in that case, they do not need to carry a huge amount of cash all the time. All they need just carry a debit card or some check and write check when they want to buy something. And the check and the debit card is called the medium of exchange. The definition is the medium of exchange is an item that people can easily use to engage in transaction. Just like for savers, they do not need to carry a huge amount of cash anymore. All they need just to carry some checks and debit card to pay. That's the medium of exchange. And another part for the second role of bank is store of value, which means people could save money there. They can store their own savings. They can store their own wealth. So this part is easy, and we are already familiar with banks. The next part, maybe we are not that familiar, is the mutual funds. Mutual funds, it's a portfolio. It's a selection of various types of stocks, bonds, or both stocks and bonds. Remember, when we talk about stocks, maybe for some companies, stocks is expensive, right? That for stocks price, and for bonds, of course, the principles is really huge. For the government issue bond, no matter local, state or the federal level, they are going to borrow like billions of dollars. And for individual investors, such as for me, I cannot use like a million to invest different stocks or bonds, right? I can only afford like $1,000. I only want to invest $1,000 to buy the stock and the bonds. How to do that easily? And then there is the mutual fund. The mutual fund sells shares to the public and they use that proceed to buy portfolios of stocks and bonds, which means mutual funds can collect a huge amount of different individuals, small amount of money. Like for me, I only can afford $1,000, and 1 million people like me can pay like a huge amount of money. And the mutual fund are going to collect this amount of money, that's a huge, and buy different portfolios of stocks and bonds. That's the definition for mutual funds. The advantages for the mutual funds allow people with small amounts of money to diversify their holdings. More diversity means less risk. For example, for me, if I only have $1,000, I cannot use that amount of money to buy different type of stocks or bonds. So I can use that amount of money to buy the mutual funds, which could lower my risk. But at the same time, if the risk is lower, then the returns, the interest rate will also be low. The second advantage is give ordinary people access to the skills of professional money managers. For me, personally, I cannot distinguish which stocks is better than the other, or which companies could earn more benefit than the other. So in that case, I cannot invest well compared with the professional managers. So in that way, I can buy just the mutual fund. In that way, the professional managers are going to use my money to buy some value companies' stock or bonds and to earn more benefit than I can acquire from that part. So there are two advantages for mutual funds. Some important identities. Gross domestic product, GDP, or we use Y to stand for it. We already learned this equation, and again, this is a very important equation. Y equals to C plus I plus G plus NX. Y, GDP, C, consumption, investment, government purchases, and net export. But under this expression, that's the open economy, because we have net export, which means we have both imports and exports, right? But in this chapter, we assume that this is a closed economy, which means we do not have exports or imports, which means net export equal to 0. So if this nx equal to 0, which means y only equals to c plus I plus g, which is this equation. And the next step, I'm going to move I to the left-hand side and move y to the right-hand side. And after that, I'm going to get a new equation, which is I equals to y minus c minus g. So that's the first part. First of all, the assumption is that this is the closed economy, which means the net export equal to 0, and have some movement, I can get the equation for I for investment. The next part is I have some definition for S, which is the national savings. National savings, I use S to stand for it. The definition for S for national saving is total income in the economy that remains after paying for the consumption and the government purchases. That's my definition for saving. So according to that definition, that the total income, which is equal to Y right here, and that remains after paying for consumption. Consumption is C. And also the government purchases, which is G. So Y minus G minus C, consumption, and the minus G equals to S. This according to the definition here, the national savings definition. And we can see these two equations. Y equals to Y minus C minus G. And the S also equals to Y minus C minus G. And in the closed economy, again, it's for the closed economy, not for the open economy. We can get saving, or the national saving. This is the national saving, all right? The big S is national saving. Equals to the investment. S equals to I. We get I from the original equation, but we assume that nx equal to 0, and we get S according to the definition here. And after these two equations, we can obtain that S equals to I. Okay, then I also define T, the big T, the uppercase T equals to the taxes minus transfer payments. Here, why I need to minus the transfer payments? Because back to the definition of consumption or investment or government purchases in chapter 10, we remember that transfer payments belongs to the part of consumption, right? Because when the government transfers some money to the low-income people, they are going to use that amount of money to pay the food, to pay the services, to pay the rent and everything. They are going to spend them immediately. So, which means the transfer payments belongs to the consumption or part of the consumption. So, in that case, we define that T equals to all the taxes the government collected, but it should minus the transfer payments. So that's the total income the government could have, and which means the government can use that amount of money, that T, to spend to buy some other stuff for the governments. So after we have T, another term, we can rewrite this equation into X equals to Y minus T minus C plus T minus G. How to get this? Well, just minus 1T and the plus 1T. If we minus 1T and plus 1T, this still equal to 0, and the equation holds, right? That's how we get the equation here. Minus 1T and the plus 1T. We put 1 minus T in the first parenthesis and T minus G in the second parenthesis. After that change, we can get the private saving equals to Y minus T minus C. So you can imagine just yourself like a consumers or household. What part of money you are going to save is you should have your income first, right? And with that income, you should pay some tax to the government, and that's T. Except that part, you also need to use some of your income to buy some goods, some services you need within this month, and that's the consumption. After, what remains will be the savings for a normal household, minus the tax and minus the consumption. So the private saving is Y minus T minus C. Income that household have left after paying for taxes and consumption, that's the private savings. And the same logic for the government. The public saving equals to T minus G. Remember, T equals to all the taxes, all the revenue, but minus the transfer payments. And the tax minus transfer payments is all the money the government can spend, can use for the government purchases. So that's the total revenue for government. The minus G, the government purchases, that's the public saving. So tax revenue that the government has left after paying for its spending. Which means the first parenthesis is the private saving, and the second part is the public saving. And plus these two parts together, which is the national saving. Alright, this uppercase S stands for the national saving. So the national saving equals to private saving plus public saving. The next part is the budget surplus or deficit. So this just refers to the government, to the public saving part. Alright, so the budget surplus, which equals to T minus G. You can understand that for the surplus, which means the government has more revenue than its spending, right? So the T should be bigger than G, which means the revenue should be bigger than the spending. In that case, that's the surplus. Excess of tax revenue over government spending, that's the public saving, equals to T minus G, that's positive, which means this is bigger than 0. And the opposite is the budget deficit. T minus G is smaller than 0. The deficit means the government is going to spend more money than its revenue, than it collects from all citizens. In that case, that's the deficit. So shortfall of tax revenue from government spending equals to minus public saving equals to G minus T. So in this part, you should remember that no matter when I talk about surplus or deficit, it should always be positive, all right? Always positive. When we talk about surplus, which means the revenue is bigger than the spending, so we should use T minus G. The bigger T and the smaller G, that's positive, that's surplus. When we talk about deficit, which means the government spending is excises the revenue. So G is bigger than T. So when we talk about deficit, we should use the bigger G minus T, which is still positive number or figure, all right? So surplus T minus G equals to public saving, and the deficit equals to G minus T equals to the negative public saving. The meaning of saving and the investment. First is the private saving. Remember, private saving equals to Y minus T minus Z, which is household income minus the tax and minus the consumption here. Some examples of what household to do with the savings. So after the tax, after the consumption, what households can use that amount of money for? Well, the first thing is buying corporate bonds or equities. I marked it here just because the definition of this part is different from our basically understanding, right? When we talk about investment, we usually say, okay, I'm going to use some money to buy some bonds, to buy some stocks. But here, buy corporate bonds and equities, which means the saving is not investment here. So please remember this part. I use some money to buy the bonds or equities. That's how I use my savings. That's not investment. This part belongs to private savings. This is important. And other than that is purchases or certificate of deposit at bank. That's normal. Buy shares of mutual fund that accumulate in saving or checking accounts. In this part, this is different between different from what our understanding, but others are the same. So you only need to remember this special one. That's it for private saving. The next part is the investment. So it's the purchase of new capitals. Remember, when we talk about GDP, we usually talk about new stuff we produce or something like buying a new house. Anything is new. Anything produced before in the last period, that should belong to the GDP of the last period, not this period. So for investment here, just the purchase of the new capital. Some examples like General Motors spent $250 million to build a new factory in Ohio, or buy $5,000 worth of computer equipment for a business, or spend $300,000 have a new house. So everything is new here, which is the investment. And again, the investment is not the purchase of stock and bonds. And this part, purchase of stock and bonds, belong to savings. Let's do this together, all right? This example together. According to the question, we can find out some numbers, like the GDP, Y equals to 19 trillion, and what else? C, 13, G, 2.5. The budget deficit. Remember, deficit means the government spending is bigger than the revenue. So G should be bigger than minus T, that's positive, right? And according to this question, this is equal to 1.2. If G minus T equals to 1.2, which means T minus G equals to the T minus G equals to negative 1.2, which means T minus 2.5 equals to negative 1.2. So T equals to 1.3. According to the deficit and the government spending, we can get what's the government's revenue, what's the tax equals to $1.3 trillion. In that case, we can plug this 1.3 back to here. T 1.3, 1.3. And with all the numbers, we can figure out S, private saving, and public saving, and everything else, right? So for this part, the private saving equals to 19 minus 1.3 minus 13, which is equal to 4.7. For public saving, we already got that. So the national saving would be equal to private saving 4.7 and minus 1.2, which is equal to 3.5. That's the national saving. So how about next part? What if the government cuts tax by $300 billion and find new budget deficit? So at this time, everything will be the same except the budget deficit. In this part, all others are the same, like GDP doesn't change, consumption doesn't change, government spending doesn't change. But the government tax, the tax is going to decrease. Remember before we saw that tax equals to 1.3. And at this time, the tax cut the taxes by 300 billions, which means the tax only equals to $1 trillion. So find out new X national savings or the budget the budget deficit. The same if we have all the number here, so this 19 minus 1 minus 13, that's the private saving equals to 5. For the government deficit equals to G minus T. But for public saving is equal to the negative of budget deficit, right? So it's 1 minus 2 public saving is 1 minus 2.5, which is negative 1.5. And when we sum these two numbers together, is again the national saving equals to 3.5. That's for A part, if consumers save the entire tax cut, which means for consumers, the consumption doesn't change. That's for part A. What about part B? Like consumers save 1/3 and spread the other 2/3 of the tax cut. For the part B, which means why the GDP doesn't change equals to 19 again. But the tax is before it was 1.3 trillion, and after government cuts 300 billions, so the tax left is $1 trillion. And for the part B, consumers save 1/3 and spend the other 2/3. So for $0.3 trillion, the consumers are going to save 0.1. And they're going to spend consumption will increase by $0.2 trillion, right? That's what we can get from the B part. The consumption increased by this amount. So which means the consumption here is not 13 anymore. It should be 13 minus 0.2, which is 13.2. But for the government, everything will be the same. So 1 for T and 2.5 for spending. We can get the new national savings for part B. So 19 minus 1 minus 13.2 equals to 4.8. So for this part, public saving is 1 minus 2.5 equals to minus 1.5. So the total national saving should equal to 4.8 minus 1.5 equals to 3.3. So what we can get from this question? That's the national saving for the first part if consumers save the entire tax cut. And this is the new national savings if consumers are going to spend some of the tax cut for consumption. If consumers spend some tax cuts for consumption, which means the new national savings is going to decrease, right? From $3.5 trillion to $3.3 trillion. That's decreasing. Do we still remember for part A? What's the national saving for that part? It's again, that's for part A. That's still $3.5 trillion. But what we can get from this question? Well, we can get if the government tax doesn't change, which means the national saving will not change either. But if the government decrease the tax it's going to collect, or the government have some tax cut, then it depends on the consumer's option. If consumers are going to save all the tax cut, the national saving will not change. But if the consumers is going to use some of the tax cut for consumptions, in that case, the national saving will decrease. So all in all, usually if the government decrease or have some tax cut, if government have this tax cut, usually the national saving, the X, big X, will decrease. Because for most of consumers, they are not going to save all of their saving cuts. Most of the consumers are going to spend some part of tax cut. So which means if there is a tax cut, usually the national saving will decrease. All right, that's what we can get from this question. So that's the solution for part A. Again, this is the solution for part B. If you still get a little bit confused, you can go back to this slide later. The market for loanable funds. Loanable funds market a supply-demand model. So this market is still a supply-demand model, or it's kind of like every market is kind of like a supply and demand model. But this loanable funds market is the model of the financial system. Remember, financial system including the financial markets and the financial intermediaries. It helps us understand how the financial system coordinates savings and the investment. How government policies and other factors affect the saving investments, the interest rate. Before we investigate this loanable funds market, we need to have some assumptions, right? And that's for economics model. When we talk about economics model, we usually have some assumptions before to make it easier to understand. So this part, we assume that there is only one financial market, which means we study the aggregate financial system here, just one. And all savers deposit their savings in this market, and all borrowers take out loans from this market. There is one interest rate, which is both the return to saving and the cost of borrowing. So that's our assumption. And, we are going to learn more about what is loanable funds in the next slide. So in the loanable fund, again, it's a supply and demand market, right? And what's the supply here in this market is the saving. Saving is the demand. Saving is the supply part of the loanable funds market. Saving is the source of the supply of loanable funds. So saving includes the private saving, Y minus D minus C, and also it includes the public saving, T minus G. If T minus G is positive, which means it's a surplus, and adds to national savings and the supply of loanable funds. If T minus G is negative, if it's negative, then that's deficit. It reduces national savings and the supply of loanable funds here. So if T minus G is positive or negative, it depends on T and G, right? Either T change or G change. If T increase, then T minus G will increase. If T decrease, T minus G will decrease. If G increase but T doesn't change, then T minus G will decrease. If G decrease, then T minus G will increase. This slide is the supply part of loanable funds. What's the slope looks like with this? The same as the product market, right? It should be the upward straight line. Let's have a little review about what's the product market. Usually the vertical axis is the price, the horizontal axis is quantity, right? So for the supply curve, it should be an upward line. That's the supply curve for product market. Which means when the price gets higher, suppliers are going to produce more quantities because more revenue. For the loanable funds market, so vertical axis and the horizontal axis is different from the product market. The vertical axis here is R, the interest rate, and the horizontal axis is the loanable funds. So please distinguish these two different markets, alright? For product market, it's P and Q. But for the loanable fund market, it's R and the loanable funds. But still, the supply curve is still upward straight line. So why is the upward? Because an increase in the interest rate makes the saving more attractive, which increases the quantity of loanable funds supplied. So when the interest rate increase, like from 3 points to 6 points, imagine as a private saving or savers, what are you going to do? At this moment, if the interest rate for the saving is 3%, maybe I'm only going to save like $100. But if the interest rate for saving increase from 3% to 6%, I'm going to save more because more revenues I can earn. 6% is much better than 3%. That's the reason why the supply curve is saving. The higher interest rate and the higher supply is still the upward straight line. The next part is the demand for loanable funds. It's the investment. Investment is source of the demand for loanable funds. So again, for the loanable fund market, the supply curve is the saving, the demand curve is the investment. Firms borrow the funds they need to pay for new equipment, factories, etc. And the households can also borrow the funds they need to purchase new houses and others. So in the loanable fund market, the demand curve is still downward. That's the D, demand. And for the product market, again, the demand curve is still negative, right? It's D. That's the product market, and that's the loanable market. Why for product market the demand is D? Because for consumers, when the price gets lower, I want to buy more of that product because the opportunity cost of that product decreased. So my net benefit will increase. I'm going to buy more. And the same logic for this loanable fund market. When the interest rate gets lower, such as if I want to buy a new house, I need to borrow money from the bank. If the interest rate is 6%, maybe I need to pay more interest back to the bank. I do not want to do that. At that time, maybe that's not a good time for me to buy a new house. But what if the interest rate decreased from 6% to 2% or 3%? Well, that would be a good time for me to buy a new house, right? Because with the same amount of loan from the bank, I only need to pay like a third or half interest back to the bank. So in that way, when the interest rate gets lower, for investment for the borrowers, they are going to need more money. They are going to borrow more money from the bank or from the financial system and use that for the new investment. And that explains like why D is still negative. A fall in interest rate reduces the cost of borrowing, which increases the quantity of loanable fund demand. So again, back to these pictures. First of all, you need to distinguish different markets. For different market, the access units are different. For product market, it's price and quantity. But for the loanable fund market, it should be interest rate and the loanable fund. But the supply curve and demand curve are exactly the same. Supply upward and the demand is downward. And again, the same as the product market, we can find an equilibrium here. The equilibrium on the market for loanable funds is the intersection between supply and demand curve. So the intersection is the equilibrium, and the same for the product market. At this equilibrium point, the interest rate adjusts to equal supply and demand. So equilibrium quantity of the loanable funds, I equals to S. So which means at this equilibrium interest rate R star, the money needed for the borrowers and the money supplied by the savers are equal to each other. At this point, the saving equals to investment. And again, for this part, when the price equals to the equilibrium price, and then quantity supply equals to the quantity demand. So that's the equilibrium quantity, and as well, this is the equilibrium long-term fund. At this equilibrium point, US equals to investment. National saving equals to the investment. That's equilibrium Y equals to equilibrium S. In this figure or graph equals to $60 billion. The same as the product market, right? Just the intersection, that's the equilibrium. At that point, at that equilibrium, investment equals to saving. The same as the product market, we also have some surplus and shortage. If the interest rate is lower than the equilibrium, well, you can see here for R1, if the interest rate is smaller, the equilibrium interest rate is 5%, right? That's the intersection. R1 is smaller than that. What will happen? Then QS, supply here, is smaller than QD. In that case, there is a shortage. When supply is smaller than demand or demand is bigger than the supply, that's the shortage. But this is the loanable fund, it's not the product, because this is the loanable fund market. That will encourage lenders to raise the interest rate. Why? Because there are fewer savers, but more borrowers. Then savers can have so many choices. They can choose like which borrowers I want to lend money to or loan money to, right? And in that case, of course, I want to increase my interest rate. I want to increase my revenue, my benefit, and that will encourage the interest rate go up, which encourage more savings, because if the interest rate go up according to the supply curve, higher interest rate, more people are going to save in this financial system. But that will discourage the borrowers, because the interest rate gets higher. The borrowers are going to borrow fewer money than before, which will end up at the equilibrium point, back to 5%. The same as the product market, right? When the price is lower, then demand is higher than the supply, and buyers are going to compete with the limited product, drive the price up, back to the equilibrium point. If the interest rate is higher than the equilibrium, like R2, and then you can see a surplus, because supply is bigger than the demand. Or demand is smaller than the supply. There is a surplus of loanable funds and decrease the interest rate and back to the equilibrium point. Same logic as the product market, right? So, and again, the same as the product market, after we know the equilibrium, we should know what determinants will change the supply curve or the demand curve, and we need to find out the new equilibrium, right? And for this part, the loanable fund market, there are also some other determinants to change the supply curve or the demand curve. The first one is the saving incentives, like the tax incentive for saving, increase the supply of loanable funds. If the government use some policies to encourage the saving, which means the supply is saving again, right? To encourage saving, which means the national saving will increase, and that will move the S curve, the supply curve, to the right-hand side. But the saving incentive or the encourage of saving will not change the borrowers or investment behavior. investors' behavior. So the demand curve doesn't change because that is only the encourage or incentive for the saving. Only change the supply curve. So in that case, let's move to the right hand side. We can see the new equilibrium here. The interest rate decreased and the loanable funds quantity increased. So return S and I. The higher quantity, the higher loanable funds, the higher supply or the higher savings and the higher investments when the interest rate is lower. That's the first part, the saving incentive. Again, because the saving incentive just change the saving behavior, which will only move the supply curve, because supply curve stands for saving. The next one is the investment incentive. And back to the loanable fund market, the demand curve is the investment. If there is an investment incentive, that will only change the demand curve, because it will only change the investment. So if there is an incentive for investment, the demand curve for the money for the loanable fund will increase. The demand curve is going to shift to the right hand side. In that case, this supply curve doesn't change because this is the investment incentive, it's not the saving. So the new equilibrium is here. You can see the interest rate increase. And also the S saving and investment will also increase. So return S and Y. All need to distinguish just if that incentive for the saving or for investment. For saving, it will only increase or move the S supply curve. If that's for investment, will only change the demand curve. I think it's easy if you already know the product market. And the third one, the policy 3, government budget deficit and surpluses. For the deficit, again, it should be G is bigger than T. Excess of government spending over tax revenue. Government debt, it should be the accumulation of all past government borrowings. That's the definition for government debt, right? It's not just the debt this year. It should be the accumulation of all past government borrowings. And budget surplus, T is bigger than G. Excess of tax revenue over government spending, repay some of the government debt. And the balance budget, which G equals to T. So for government, the best option would be this one, balance budget. But for different scenarios, different areas, the government are going to choose different strategies. That's the government budget, deficit, and surpluses. So let's find out this example question. If there is an increase in government spending or decrease in tax, what's the new equilibrium will be? Will this change the supply curve or demand curve? Move to the left or move to the right hand side? For the loanable fund market, this is R and this is loanable fund, right? So that's the original equilibrium, supply and demand. Remember, supply means savings, and the demand it means investment. So in this case, according to the question here, it tells you that there is a budget deficit, which means the government either increase the G, right? Either increase this one, bigger G, or decrease T, or this one. No matter which one, increase T or decrease G, increase G or decrease T, this Y is going to get smaller, become smaller, right? Either way, increase G, this value will get smaller if the government decrease G. Or the government decrease T, this number will get smaller as well, right? So in this case, the total S, the national savings will decrease because of bigger G or smaller G. In that case, the S curve, the supply of saving, the national saving should shift to the left-hand side. And we can see the new equilibrium, the interest rate will get higher. And the quantity for the loanable funds and the investing will get smaller. This is how we get the first part, A. Alright? Just consider like a G, T, and G for S. If this is the public saving. If this one gets bigger, then the national saving is getting bigger. And the total supply, just like here, remember we have an assumption that only one financial system here. So all savings will be the national saving. It will be the private saving plus the government saving. So if the national saving increase, which decrease, which means the vector are going to shift to the left-hand side. And the Y, this part is getting smaller because according to the deficit here, either bigger G, that's smaller, or smaller G, that's again smaller. That's the deficit. And for B, analyze the effect of the budget surplus. The surplus is the same. What's the definition of surplus? Surplus, it should be the revenue of government minus G. It should be bigger than zero, right? That's the surplus. The government's revenue is bigger than its spending. So that's the opposite situation or scenario. Surplus means this one will get bigger, and which means the S, the national saving, will get bigger. So for the second case, for B, such as this is B, the S is going to shift to the right side, and we will get a lower interest rate and higher amount of investment of the quantity of loanable funds. That's the answer for part B. Just based on this example question, what we can learn from this one? That's A. And this is the B, shift to the right hand side. And what we can learn is the lessons from this policy is for budget deficit that will reduce the national savings. If G is bigger than T, then T minus G is getting smaller. So the national saving is getting smaller. Deficit reduce the national savings and decrease the supply of the loanable funds. Interest rate rises and investment falls. If there is a budget surplus, then increase national savings because T minus G is getting bigger. So S, the national saving, is getting bigger. Increase the supply of loanable funds, reduce the interest rate, and stimulate the investment. That's what we can learn from this example question. But, for investment, since investment is very important for the long run economic growth, right? Because we learned before, for the Y over L is the positive relationship with K over L. If more K, which means more productivity. Sorry, if there is more K per labor, then there is more productivity. So more investment means more K, which means more productivity. But we can also see here, if there is a deficit, which means the national savings is going to decrease, and which means the investment is going to fall. And which means in the long run, if the government has a budget deficit, then in the long run, the productivity in that country will not be good. So the budget deficit reduces the economy's growth rate and the future standard of living. All right, that's we can learn from this slide. What we want, the best way is the balanced budget. But the budget deficit will deteriorate of our standard of living in the future, because that will result in a fall investment. This is the US government debt as the percentage of GDP. The higher debt means the higher deficit, right? So we can see the highest deficit happened during the World War II. And during 2008, the financial crisis, the percentage of debt to the GDP is around 80 at the time. Still, that was really high. And then at that time, crisis happened and the people's standard of living decreases. This picture shows you what happens during the pandemic, the coronavirus, right? After 2020, the Q1, we can see the percentage of debt over GDP increases by a huge amount. And the government, the federal government borrowed a huge amount of money. Back to the financial crisis, the percentage was around 80, that's 2008. So 2008 around here, that's around 80. So at this moment, you can see that's almost 140, right? Or 130. That's even higher than the World War II. So which means during this period, the debt as the percentage of GDP is almost the highest period. Which means the government government deficit is the highest period. And that could influence our standard of living in the future. Because the national saving decrease and the fewer investment in the future, the fewer capital per labor in the future, which means the lower Y over L or productivity in the future. So this is not a good sign. So what government should do? Either increase its tax revenue or cut its government spending to decrease this debt, right? So two ways. The debt or the deficit is T minus G. Either increase T to decrease the debt or deficit, or decrease G to decrease the deficit. So that's what government should do. This is the last part for this chapter. That's the elements of financial crisis. The large decline in some asset prices. That usually will happen during the crisis, like during 2008 and 2009, the housing prices fell 30%. That's the first element. And the second one, spread insolvencies at financial institutions, like banks and other institutions failed when many, homeowners stopped paying their mortgages. And for the second element, that's related to the borrowers, because they cannot repay the money they should pay. And the third one, decline in confidence in financial institutions, which means the customers with uninsured deposits began pulling their funds out of financial institutions. And the third elements relate to the borrowers, relate to the savers or the lenders. The fourth element is the credit crunch. Borrowers are able to get loans because of troubled lenders, not confidence in borrowers' credit worthiness. 5. Economic downturn. So failing financial institutions and fall in investment cause the GDP to fall and the unemployment to rise. Vicious circle, the downturn reduce the profit and asset values with worsen the crisis. So what you need to remember for this 6 is something like I gave you an environment or some scenario situations. You need to tell me like what that scenario belongs to. If that belongs to large decline in some asset prices or decline in confidence in financial institutions. That's what you need to remember for these 6 elements. All right, you need to distinguish the different scenarios. So that's all I want to talk about in this chapter.